So it's lesson 3 of Intro to Web Programming. And today we're looking at how do we pull data out of a database and display it in a web page using PHP. So we're going to open up the things we did last week. First thing I'm going to do is start my local server. So I'll open my Zip control panel. I'll just start the Apache web server. And I'll start the MySQL server. You probably don't need to start your MySQL server because when you installed MySQL in your database class, it loads MySQL automatically when your operating system starts for most people. So I need to start the MySQL server separately. Most of you probably don't need to do that. Just start your local web server. Now I'll open up PHP Storm. And I'll open our restaurant website we started building last week that I think we called Barry Eats, if I remember the name correctly. I'm going to ignore the PHP Storm now. I don't want to take the time to download and install them. So last week we made a couple. First we made a test form, and then we made these 2 pages. Restaurant page. So we had a form where users could add a new restaurant, and then we had a save page where we grabbed the information about the new restaurant. We connected to our database. So in this case, I'm connecting to my local host, the MySQL server that runs on my own laptop. We set up our SQL command, and then we populated the values into parameters. So every restaurant has a name, an address, and a phone. And then we executed our SQL statement, and we disconnected from the database. Why do we need to disconnect from the database? We talked about this last week. We don't have to do it, but it's a really good idea. How come? Right. So a database will only have so many connections available. So if we leave our connection open, it might mean if the website's really busy, someone else will be waiting to make another request to the database. So as soon as we're done saving our new restaurant, we want to disconnect. I'm also going to open up my SQL Workbench so we can also look at our database as we're working. So most days when you come to class, it's probably a good idea to open up all 3 of these applications. If you have Zip or WAMP installed, make sure your server's started. You can open up your code editor and open up your PHP pages, and you can also open up the MySQL Workbench so that we can manipulate or look into the database whenever we need to. So I'll just run this query I wrote last week so we can see what's in here. So we actually added 2 restaurants at the end of class last week. We had the last class here on campus, and we have Smoke's Poutineery down on Dunlop Street. So I think maybe what we'll do before we select data, I'm maybe going to load my restaurant form in the browser. Maybe we'll add a few more. It'd be good to maybe have at least 4 or 5 different records in our database. So I could insert them here by typing an SQL insert command, but it's actually easier if I just go to my restaurant form we built last week. So I'll go to localhost 800, Barry Eats. And here's our form. Not so beautiful, but it's functional. So let's add a couple of other restaurants here. Anybody else have another restaurant in Barry you'd like to go and eat at? Sorry, Boone Burger? I like Boone Burger. Okay. Berlene, can you quickly look up the address and phone number? Can you do a Google search and tell me what the address and phone number is? And we'll add it in. You can add in anything you like here. You don't have to add in. Okay, and what's the phone number there? 13? Yep. Okay. Tells me it was saved. I'll just check my database again. Okay, got Boonberger there. And I'll just maybe go back and load up my form one more time. Can we add one more? Someone else have another restaurant you like? Wimpy's, okay. Was that Wimpy's on Sunday? Okay, which one? There's a lot of them, so just give me an address of the one you like to go to. There are several in Barrie. Right on Up Street? Okay, what's the phone number? Yep. Yep. Okay. I'm going to put real data in my database. You can put in anything you want. Restaurant 1, Restaurant 2, Restaurant 3. Or if you're from a different country, you can put in your favorite restaurants from back home. That's fine too. So we'll just make sure we now have 4. So notice we have restaurant ID. When we created our database last week, we said that the IDs were going to start at 10,000. So we have from 10,000, 1, 2, and 3. These are our IDs. So now what we want to do is we want to be able to select and show this kind of list in our website so somebody can actually see the list of restaurants in the database. Right now, the only way you can do it is to have a login to the database and have MySQL Workbench and know how to write an SQL query. Well, most people don't have any of those things. They want to use their browser, go to the website, and see a bunch of data. So let's make a new PHP page. I'm going to right-click my project, and I'll say make a new PHP file. Maybe I'll call this names only. We won't put any formatting. This won't be our final page. We'll make a better version of the restaurant page later. For now, we just want to look at how do we select the names and display them. I'll say yes to this, doesn't matter. So we want this page to work kind of like the Georgian College Facebook profile. As soon as a user loads this page, we want it to go to the data, connect to our database, write a query, fetch some data, and then display it. We'll need some PHP tags here. And if you recall the way we kind of built this page last week, before we wrote any of the code, we planned out all the steps and we put all the comments on here, laying out all the steps we would need in order to make our save page work. We're going to do the same thing on our restaurant names page. We don't write any code. First, we'll just plan the process because we're going to need somewhere in the neighborhood of 4, 5, 6 steps in order to be able to show these 4 restaurant names on this page. So we know we're going to need PHP code. So what's one thing we're going to have to do on here? We want this page to show the names of the restaurants that are in our database. Okay, that's definitely, thank you, Jill. We'll definitely need at some point to connect to the database. That connection line will be exactly the same as the connection line we used last week when we were saving. So we'll need the same parameters when we do that. What else are we going to have to do here? Okay. When we do this, right, when we're using a loop, we have no way to just print the whole thing. We're going to have to print one record at a time. Okay, yep. Okay, so that would be part of this, maybe. Well, for now, we'll leave the table out. We'll just do it with no formatting. We just want to kind of ugly, just simple data only. We'll come to the formatting in a bit. Because yes, you're right, Jill. We are going to want HTML formatting. First, we'll just look at a simplified version with no formatting. Just get the data and print it. Anything else we have to do here? Yep. So the fetching is kind of two parts. Before we fetch it, we'll have to set up the query we want to execute, right? Because we can write any kind of select statement. So we'll have to write the specific SQL command that we want. So we'll set that up. We'll execute and fetch the data. That will give us an array. And then we're going to loop through and display. So this is the process. And we're going to use this exact same process every time we're fetching and displaying data from a database. So we talk a lot about this acronym in programming in general, and especially in web programming, CRUD, C-R-U-D. What is that? You guys have probably heard it before in other classes. What does that mean? Right. The C is create, read, update, and delete. Right? So every page we build in a web application will do at least one and maybe more of these things. We can look at a few simple examples. All right, we'll just load today's news. Which of these things are happening on this page? What's the main operation happening? Is it doing a create? Are we creating data, reading data, updating, or deleting? Yeah. So here we're mostly reading. If we go in here, what else can we do besides read? Right? When we see a form, that's an indication we can also create data, right? If I type something in here and I have an account, it will add that comment to the comments table in the database. But most of the time it's reading. What about, well, here, I'll just log in for a moment. What about here? Which of the CRUD operations are available for me here? Yeah, pretty much all of them, right? Mostly I'm reading because I'm looking at I'm reading all of the data about Georgian College from the Facebook database, right? The posts, the media. So mostly I'm reading. But virtually everywhere there's a button, what's happening? If I click like, which of these am I doing? Yeah, I'm creating because Facebook records this account likes this item, right? So every time you click like or interested or share, anytime you do those things, we're creating. Now, where could I do update or delete on here? Where would I have the ability to do that? Yeah, I could create a post. Okay, so in the options, the place we can actually, I don't know that I can actually edit and delete on here, on this page, but I could edit and delete here, right? If I want to, I could, on my own profile, I could edit or delete. So which of these do you think happens the most on web applications? Which is the most popular CRUD operation? Create, read, update, or delete? Yeah, probably read most of the time. Almost any website we go to, most of what we're doing is reading data, right? If we're shopping for something, we're looking at the categories and products and pictures and reviews. If we create, it's on a shopping site, we're maybe making a comment or review, or we're making an order, right? By ordering something, we're creating. So probably in all web applications, reading is about 80%. So reading or selecting data, what we're doing today, that's about 80% of what happens in any kind of web application. Creating's maybe about 10%, 15, and these are maybe 5% each. We can do update and delete, but we don't typically do a lot of it. We only have the ability to update or delete usually a little bit. So the vast majority of the time, what we're doing is this. We want to see stuff that's in somebody's database. Products, posts, news, whatever it is you're interested in. We're reading data. So the reason I mention that is this process that we've set up, it works the same way every time. Doesn't matter if we're reading a Facebook profile, we're reading the news articles, we're reading Amazon's product sale, we're reading restaurant reviews. It all works the same way. Connect to the database, write a query that tells the database what information we want to see on this page, execute the query and get the data we want. And then if we have, unless we only have one record, loop through it and display the data to the browser and disconnect. And this is the same whether we're using PHP, C#, Java, Ruby, anything else. It's the same process. So we're going to do it for the first time today, and it might seem new and kind of strange. That's okay, because we're going to do it over and over and over again, and soon this will be really easy because it's repetitive. We don't have to change it every time we do a different page showing different data. We just do the same process again. We just change the query and change the output. But we're doing the same thing repetitively. And when we repeat those in practice, we tend to get pretty comfortable and get familiar. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to connect. We're going to write the exact same connection we wrote last week. So this PHP page is able to see and interact with this database. So I'll create a database variable just like we did last week. We'll use the PDO library. So we said every time we connect from a PHP page to a database, there are 5 pieces of information we need to make that connection. What's one thing we're going to need here? We need the database name. Yep. Right. Yep. So the server. Yeah, either the IP address or server name. Yep. So what server? What database on that server? What else do we need to connect? Yep, the credentials. So we need a username and password. And we need one other thing. Jill already said that. So the database name, server name, username, password. We need one more thing. Well, that's the database name. Sorry, yeah, the host is the server name. Same. That's the same thing. Look at your Save Restaurant page we did last week. There's one other piece of information in that connection besides the host, database name, username, and password. It's actually the very first piece of information we used. Right, what type of database is it? Because this PDO object, it can connect to any kind of database, but it uses a different driver and a different library depending on the type of database we're using. So we start with MySQL : host equals. I'm going to use localhost. You set up your database on AWS, your host will be aws.computerstudies. Database name equals. So I called my database Barry Needs. And if you're using AWS, your database name is GC and your student number. And then your username. And PHP Storm is nice because notice it gives me the gray prompts telling me what parameters next. As soon as I type a comma, it says now we need the username. So if you're on localhost, your username is probably root. That's the default. If you're on AWS, your database name and your username are the same, GC and your student number. And lastly, your password, which on my local server is just an empty string on AWS. You'll find that password in your email with your AWS credential. So this line, I'll just check it against what we did last week. That's exactly the same. MySQL, host equals local. Last week I spelled it like this. Because I'm on Windows, it's actually not case sensitive, but I will use camel case. So that's step one, write the connection. What I typically like to do after I write my connection, so that I don't forget to disconnect, is I actually go down to the bottom and I write my disconnect line right away. So what would we need down on line 20 to close the connection? Yeah, we'll just null our database object, destroys it. Now we'll write our query. This will be a relatively simple query. What is our SQL command? I've already written it. You've already seen it today, so it should be easy. What's the command that will fetch all of the restaurants from the database? Select. Okay. That would work. That would select everything. In this case, we're not actually showing, so we have 4 columns in the database, right? We have an ID, we have a name, we have an address and a phone. On this page, we only want to show the names. So this query that Jill suggested, it would work fine, but it might be a good idea to modify it just a little bit so that it would be a little more efficient. How could we make our SQL command a bit more efficient? Right. And Gerline, why would it be a good idea instead of, not wrong to use star, but why might it be a good idea to use the name instead? Right. So one of our rules when writing SQL queries is we shouldn't automatically select every column from the table. If we need them all, that's fine. Or if there's 40 columns and we need 35 of them, just write select star so we don't have to name 35 columns in our query. But other than that, we don't want to select, because if this table gets really big, if for every column we select, it makes the query run more slowly, which means our web page runs more slowly. So in general, we only want to try to select the columns we need. Like I said, that there is that one exception. We have a really big table and we want most of the columns. In that case, it's probably better just to select star. So there's our query. Just like we did last week, we also then set up a command. So we don't execute the query directly. The PDO library has a command object, and we use the command object to actually execute our SQL statements. So we're going to do the same thing today. We'll take our database object, we call prepare, and we pass in our query. So we haven't executed it yet. We're just setting it up in order to be executed. So now we're going to want to execute the query. And we're hopefully going to get back a list of restaurant names. So we need some way to store that data in PHP. So when we did our save last week, we just called the execute method. That saved the data. We don't want to call execute here because execute, it runs an SQL command, but it doesn't return anything back. Right? That was okay last week because the data was only going one way, from the browser to the database. Today, we want to call the database, but the database is going to send us back stuff. So we need something to hold it in. So instead of calling execute, we're going to call fetch. So we've got several different fetch methods here. The first one we use when we're selecting one record. So later on, if we want to click a restaurant name and see the details of that restaurant only, we can use fetch for that because we don't really need a loop. We're only selecting one record from the table. When we want multiple records instead of fetch, we'll use fetch all. That will give us a list. And then fetch column is if we just want a single value, like we just want an ID number, for example. That will be faster and more efficient. It will return just one single value, one row, one column. So in this case, we'll use fetch all. So this, if this works correctly, that will fill. I'm just going to make sure I did it right. We may need one more line of code here, but we'll try it like this. We're probably okay. Just bear with me for a second. Yeah, okay. We'll try it this way. See what happens. So if this runs correctly, well, actually, we can try this in our browser to see if we get an error. So we won't, right now, if we get a white page, then probably things are working okay. So we'll go to our browser. And now I'm just going to go back to my list. Oops, here. So here's our names only page. So I'll click on that. No errors, so that's a good sign. Our connection and our query are working okay. Nothing's died on us yet. If you want to try this, and I will show you, so if you're on AWS, how do I get my pages online? So you'll open up FileZilla. I explained there's instructions on Blackboard how to save your AWS credentials. So some people type it in here every time. You don't have to go and find your username and password and type it. If you use the Site Manager tool here, you just set up a new site and you can put your credentials in here and then they're saved. So you don't have to type it each time you come here. So you just click on your drop down. Select your AWS account. You can just say okay to this little warning screen. And then I go into public HTML. Here's the Barry Eats folder from last week. And you can just upload your files, drag and drop or double click, and then it will be available. And then to try it in your browser, go to aws.computerstudies, your student number, Barry Eats, and you click on your file there. So that's how you can load it if you're not using a local server. I know a few people had some trouble getting Web XAMPP or MAMP installed and running on their machine. So you're using AWS. Okay. So now we're going to use a loop. If this was Java code, when you fetched a bunch of data, what kind of loop would you use to loop through the data and display it? Obviously, there's many different looping structures. Which one would you use? We could use a for loop. Yep, that would work. What other kinds of loop could we use? We could use a while loop. Yeah, or if we have a collection of objects, which we do in this case, we have a collection of data, we could use a for each. So typically in PHP, that's what we'll use. So we'll say for each. So restaurants is our collection. Hang on just a second. Let me double check. It's not liking my syntax. Obviously, I have done something wrong, so we'll have a quick check. Maybe I've got my for each. Ah, I do. I'm writing C# syntax instead of PHP. So usually, like in Java or C#, we would write the singular in the collection. In PHP, the for each syntax is different. For each collection as a single, which I find this syntax is kind of confusing. The Java or C# syntax makes more sense to me. So now our current restaurant is just represented by R. So restaurants is our collection. R is one item in the collection. So now we just want to print the name to the screen, no formatting. What command do we use in PHP to display a value to the script to the browser? Yeah, so we use echo. Well, remember, R is itself an array. Right? Whatever columns we selected in our query will be in this array. So we want R, our name column, because that's what we're selecting up on line 14. So let's try this and see if we get a list. So go back, refresh your browser, and see what you get. Do you get a white screen? Do you get an error? Or do you get a list of restaurants? File not found? Okay, so that's a URL problem. You're getting a 404 error. So let's see when I refresh. Okay. Anybody else get a white screen? Anybody get a list of restaurant names? I think I missed one step. Yeah. Aha. Before this, we never actually called execute on our command. So our query never actually ran. So before we call fetch, need to call the execute method, just like we did on save. So when we save, we call execute. We didn't need to fetch anything. So I neglected execute. So I'll try that. Now our formatting is not very good here. Doesn't look great, but it is functional. It at least gives us the right data. We actually had, how many lines of code? 2, 3, 4, 5. Basically 8 lines of code we need here in order to fetch our data and display it. So we set up our connection in our query. We executed the query, ran a fetch to store our results, and then we just loop through. And now it's important we also don't disconnect until our loop is done. If we disconnect here, we'll lose the data. The data is only available while our connection is open. So we don't want to close that connection or we're going to lose all the data we just queried. Anybody getting an error when they're actually still getting an error? What does it say? Does it say access denied? Okay, what does it say?
They can't even save my restaurant.
Okay, if you're getting file not found, that means the action property on your form does not match the name of any file in the directory. Notice my action is save restaurant, and I have a page called save restaurant. If you submit your form and get file not found, the action does not match any page name that exists. So you have a conflict between the action and your file name. Question? 502? Okay, what's the description of that error? What else does it say? Bad gateway. Are you working locally or using local server? Okay. One thing to check is compare your database connection here with the connection in your save page. Okay, that's a clue that may be a problem. Anybody else getting an error when they try to load the page? Is it working? No, to get an error? Okay, so that's an issue. And is it on the line number? What's the line number where your connection is? And is that your connection line? Okay, so check your credentials. Okay, and you can compare them to the save page and this page. Are they identical? You may have done something different. Anybody else have an error message on their page when they load it? What would we do if we wanted to show each one of these on a new line? How could we change? Said we wouldn't put any formatting on if we just want some really simple formatting, so at least the list is stacked vertically, one restaurant on each line. Where would we go to change that? How would we do that? Okay, where would you do that? Okay, so after we print out a name, we could append or concatenate a BR tag, which would be an HTML line break. Now, we may have talked about this last week. I can't remember. PHP has a really strange operator for concatenate. In most languages, it's a plus sign. In Java and C#, which makes sense. Add this onto the end of this. PHP does not use the plus sign to concatenate strings together. So what would need to go in here instead? PHP, for some really strange reason, a dot is concatenate. So it's like a plus in Java or C#. I have no idea why. One of those really strange. And that's why we need to use this for PHP objects. We can't use a dot because the dot already means concatenate. The dot. After each name, before we go to the next item in the loop, add a line break on the end. If we reload this now in our browser, we should get a list, one item on top of another. So now it looks a little better. At least we can read it this way. If we view the source, we can see we at least have BR tags. That are here. So this is the first of many, many pages we're going to write in this course where we're going through this exact process. Connect, set up a query, execute the query and get the results back, and then use a loop to display whatever information we selected in our query. So we're probably not going to use this page again. We wanted to do this one just as a really simple example of how to query a database with PHP and display some data. I'll show you a couple of common errors, a few common things that break this. Here's one. So if I refresh here, whenever you see this error, and we're all going to see it, I'm going to do it in class, you guys will do it too. Undefined index. Remember, this R variable, this is an array with all the columns in our query. We only selected one column called name, but if we try to output a value, a column name that isn't part of our query, it's going to crash. Or if I try to display the address, I'm going to get the same error, undefined index. Why? Well, because we're not selecting. Had we used Jill's original query, this would work, right? Where we had all the columns. But if I only select name in my query, we get this undefined index 4 times. Every time in the loop, it has a restaurant, but the restaurant, we don't have the address name because it's not in my SQL command. So the first thing to check when you see undefined index, because it's all going to happen, is we need to go to where we're displaying and check, do we have a column with that same name in our query? And that's usually the fix. We're trying to output a column that either we didn't select or maybe we just got the name wrong. My first example, I had called the column restaurant name instead of name. And if you select star, well, then you have to go and look in your database. This is why it's helpful to have MySQL Workbench open, so that we can compare the columns we're trying to display in our PHP code with the actual columns in the database itself. So most of the time when we're building web applications, we want both our code editor open and we want our database open so that we can be checking them. And this will help us fix some of our errors. I will put that back. Whoops. Does anybody have any questions about our PHP code on this page and what's happening here, and it works.
Command of that object stores data in an array.
It's actually, the command just executes the query. But then it has a fetch method that will allow us to store the results. So if we call execute, our query runs, but without calling fetch, we have no way to catch to get the results. So this line 18, that's basically doing this part, right? Making the request. And line 19 is doing this part, getting the data and sending it back to our PHP code. So the execute is happening, the execute is this way, and the fetch is coming back to the browser. And you notice it was actually probably a good thing. I accidentally forgot to include this line, but you saw when we didn't do it, we got no data, right? It was empty. So it was actually probably good that I made that mistake. I'd like to say I knew what I was doing and I did that mistake on purpose, but I didn't. I did actually forget to call the query and had to go and check what I did wrong. So it's kind of a two-step process. Execute and then fetch, right? If we're saving or updating or deleting, we don't need fetch. We just need execute because we're just modifying the database only. We don't need anything to come back. So we only will have that second step with fetch when we're doing read, but most of the time we're doing read. That's the most popular, right? We said we looked at the websites, most of the time we're reading. So most of our PHP pages, we're going to use either fetch all for a list or fetch for one record. Does that help at all, Curleen? Okay. Anybody else have any other questions about the code we've written so far? Okay. It's about 10 after 12. So why don't we take our break here? Okay, we'll take a 20-minute break. I need to step out for a bit. We'll take a break and we'll come back at 12:30 and we'll build a better version of this page. Right? This was the simple version. We'll build one where we go through the same process, but we'll actually format this. Someone mentioned we want to show this in a table. So we'll do that next. So I'll see you back here at 12:30.